Welcome back everyone to the Conscious Catalyst. This is episode 3 and this is part 2 of the Atlantis Trilogy. So we're going to discuss Atlantis before the fall, ancient advanced technology and the fifth dimension. So before we begin today's episode, let's take a moment to revisit where we left things last time. Because I feel we owe it to ourselves. We owe it to the audience. And quite frankly, we owe it to the last remaining fragments of our collective credibility. When this trilogy started, I intended to conduct a perfectly sensible investigation into Atlantis. We were going to look at Plato, some Greek texts, a few flood myths, perhaps we question a timeline or two, and then all go home as responsible adults. Instead, somewhere along the journey, Atlantis grabbed us by the ankles and dragged us screaming through a portal made entirely of giant crystals, consciousness fields, and unresolved archaeological arguments. We began in a very respectable place. We had Plato, we had historians, we had geology, we had the flood myths. Mainstream archaeology was still relatively calm at this stage. There were some uncomfortable questions being asked, sure, but everyone was still mostly wearing pants and adhering to the known laws of physics. Then things escalated. Graham Hancock showed up and asked whether we might have accidentally misplaced an entire Ice Age civilization beneath 120 meters of ocean. Robert Schoch looked at the Sphinx and politely suggested that the accepted timeline might be having an identity crisis. Edgar Cayce arrived carrying what appeared to be the largest crystal collection in human history. Dolores Cannon arrived with thousands of regression accounts describing eerily similar Atlantean stories. Then David Wilcock burst into the room, ripped the emergency brake off reality, and started asking whether consciousness, sacred geometry, resonance and matter might all be different expressions of the same underlying field. And that's roughly the point where this stopped being a history podcast and started becoming a hostage situation. By the end of the episode, we were no longer discussing whether Atlantis existed. We were discussing whether giant stone blocks could potentially be influenced through frequency. Then whether matter itself could be altered through resonance. Then whether sufficiently advanced civilizations might have understood physics differently. Then whether objects could theoretically dematerialize. Then whether things could phase through walls. At some point I looked down at my research notes and realized that I had wandered so far from mainstream archaeology that I could no longer even see the car park. Mainstream archaeology, meanwhile, was standing safely on the shore saying, "The evidence suggests this stone was moved using manpower, engineering and ramps," while Atlantis researchers were skydiving past the moon screaming, "Yes, but what if the ramps were conscious?" There is no moderation in Atlantis research, absolutely none. Normal historians look at a mysterious structure and ask, who built it? Atlantis researchers look at it and ask, who built it? What frequency was it vibrating at? Was it connected to a planetary grid? Did it amplify consciousness? Was it powered by crystals? And could it have been located in another dimension before being phased into physical reality? These are not the same conversations, and somehow, despite every fibre of my rational mind attempting to stage an intervention, I kept discovering the same themes appearing over and over again. Actually, that's a lie. My rational mind did not try to stage an intervention. I was fucking loving it. I love this shit, okay? It's so good. So ancient traditions spoke of a golden age. Plato spoke of a golden age. So did Cayce, and so did Cannon's subjects, and so did the Law of One. Everybody seems to arrive at the same basic story. A civilization becomes incredibly advanced, its understanding of consciousness expands, its technology expands, its power expands, its wisdom, well, that allegedly becomes a little more negotiable. The more I researched Atlantis, the less it felt like a story about a lost island, and the more it felt like humanity's oldest cautionary tale. Congratulations! You've unlocked godlike technology. Please try not to destroy the planet. Spoiler alert, according to the story, they may not have followed the instructions. Because today's episode takes us beyond the question of whether Atlantis existed and into a much stranger question. What was Atlantis before the fall? And when I say before the fall, I don't mean before property values dropped. I mean before the pole shifts, before the cataclysm, before the flood, and before the collapse of civilization, before giant crystals supposedly started causing problems, and before chunks of reality allegedly got downgraded to a lower operating system. Because according to some of the more esoteric traditions, Atlantis wasn't simply more technologically advanced than us. It was operating from an entirely different state of consciousness. And this is where mainstream science usually begins making the same facial expression your accountant makes when you explain cryptocurrency. Today we're going to explore the idea of fifth dimensional Atlantis. What does that actually mean? Was Atlantis literally existing in another dimension? Was it functioning at a higher vibrational state? Was it a metaphor for expanded consciousness? Or is this simply the point where the rabbit hole pauses, lights a cigarette, looks us dead in the eye, and says, mate, we're still standing at Galactic Base Camp? We'll examine the theory that Atlantis existed in a higher state of awareness before a catastrophic event caused not only the destruction of a civilization, but a planetary descent from fifth dimensional consciousness into the denser reality we now inhabit. That's right. According to some traditions, Atlantis didn't just fall, reality fell. A civilization-wide software downgrade. The ultimate cosmic, have you tried turning Earth off and on again? We'll also explore the legendary crystal technology said to have powered Atlantis. What were they? Were they energy generators, healing devices, consciousness amplifiers, information storage systems, or the world's most expensive paperweights? We'll also explore where these crystals supposedly went after the catastrophe and why every Atlantis story eventually becomes about enormous crystals capable of destroying reality. Then we move into the truly dangerous territory, consciousness technology. We're talking telepathy enhancing chambers, remote viewing, frequency healing, direct interaction between intention and matter. What many modern spiritual traditions would call manifestation, except allegedly on expert mode. In some accounts, Atlanteans didn't spend 6 months making vision boards. Conscious intention was said to influence reality almost immediately, making our current 3D experience look like internet buffering. Accessing information fields, artificially induced altered states, genetic experimentation, biological engineering, and technologies that allegedly didn't just require technical skill, but demanded that the operator achieve a coherent state of consciousness before the machine would function. Imagine explaining that requirement on LinkedIn. Seeking experienced Atlantis energy grid operator. 5 years minimum consciousness coherence preferred. Third eye certification advantageous. Must thrive in a fast-paced, multi-dimensional environment. We'll also explore planetary energy grids, Earth-scale engineering projects, and claims that Atlantis may have worked directly with the energetic structure of the planet itself. Because apparently building cities wasn't ambitious enough. No. According to some traditions, Atlanteans looked at an entire planet and thought, I reckon we can optimize that. We'll meet the mysterious children of the Law of One, the faction allegedly attempting to preserve wisdom, balance, and spiritual principles, while other groups became increasingly obsessed with power, control, and technological domination, which, if true, means Atlantis wasn't simply a story about advanced technology. It was a story about what happens when technology evolves faster than consciousness, a lesson which, if we're being honest, feels uncomfortably modern. And finally, we'll tackle the biggest question in the Atlantis mystery. Why did Atlantis fall? Was it a misuse of technology, spiritual decline, ethical corruption, genetic experimentation, a pole shift, a cosmic cycle, a planetary catastrophe? Or was Atlantis simply the most elaborate warning story ever handed down through human history? So grab a coffee, charge your crystals, align your chakras, recalibrate your frequency, and say goodbye to whatever remains of your attachment to conventional reality. Because last episode we didn't just go down the rabbit hole. We ripped the walls off physics, set fire to the instruction manual, and accidentally discovered a staircase leading into what I can only describe as the cosmic basement. And the really concerning part, we're still going down. So what exactly is the fifth dimension? Now, before we start discussing fifth dimensional Atlantis, let's address the obvious problem. Nobody can agree on what the fifth dimension actually is. Ask a physicist and you'll probably get an answer involving higher dimensional mathematics, string theory, space-time geometry, and equations that make your eyes glaze over somewhere around the third Greek symbol. Ask a spiritual teacher and you'll hear about unity consciousness, unconditional love, higher vibration, and humanity's evolutionary journey. Ask an Atlantis researcher and they'll tell you Atlantis used giant crystals, communicated telepathically, manifested reality through intention, and accidentally destroyed a continent. So let's see if we can make sense of this. The first thing to understand is that when most Atlantis researchers, Law of One students, QHHT practitioners, and New Age traditions talk about the fifth dimension, they are usually not talking about a physical location somewhere between Jupiter and Alpha Centauri. They're talking about a completely different state of consciousness and reality. Think of it this way. Imagine a fish living in water its entire life. The fish assumes water is reality. Then someone lifts the fish out of the water and shows it the sky. The sky isn't somewhere else. It's a completely different environment that was always there. The fish simply couldn't perceive it. In many ways, that's how proponents of fifth dimensional consciousness describe humanity today. We assume our sensory experience represents the full extent of reality, but does it? In many ways, that's how advocates of fifth dimensional consciousness describe humanity today. We tend to assume that what we can see, hear, touch, and measure represents the full extent of reality. But that's a surprisingly bold assumption for a species that can only perceive a tiny fraction of what is actually happening around it. The human eye can only perceive wavelengths between roughly 380 and 700 nanometers. That is a tiny sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum. Meanwhile, the electromagnetic spectrum extends from radio waves measured in kilometers all the way down to gamma rays smaller than an atomic nucleus. Some estimates place a human's perception as low as 0.0035%. And if we can only see 0.0035% of the electromagnetic spectrum, then we can only see a highly filtered projection of reality. we are only decoding a tiny fraction of the information present in the interface patterns that make up the universe. Radio waves are passing through you right now. So are microwaves, infrared radiation, and countless other forms of energy that remain completely invisible to your senses, which raises an interesting question. If we're already blind to most of the electromagnetic universe, how certain are we that we're perceiving all of reality? The fish doesn't discover a new universe when it leaves the water. It simply discovers a much larger version of the one it was already living in. That's roughly how many fifth dimensional theories describe our current situation. According to these traditions, humanity isn't trapped in a small reality because reality is small. We're experiencing a limited slice of something much larger. According to these traditions, we are living in what is often called a third dimensional reality, a dense experience where separation appears real, time appears linear, matter appears solid, and consciousness seems isolated inside individual bodies. But what does that actually mean? Look around the room that you're sitting in. Everything feels solid. The chair is solid, the table is solid, the wall is definitely solid if you've accidentally walked into one while looking at your phone. But according to modern physics, that's not really what's happening. At the atomic level, matter is mostly empty space. The atoms that make up your body are mostly empty space. The atoms that make up the chair are mostly empty space. The reason you don't fall through the chair isn't because atoms are packed together like tiny billiard balls. It's because the negatively charged electrons surrounding your atoms repel the negatively charged electrons surrounding the chair's atoms. What you experience as solid is actually an incredibly sophisticated electromagnetic standoff occurring trillions of times per second. In other words, you've never truly touched anything. Every hug you've ever received, every handshake you've ever had, and every piece of furniture you've ever sat on has actually been an energetic negotiation between electromagnetic fields. Sleep well. Physics becomes even stranger when you realize that every atom in your body is in constant motion. Molecules vibrate, atoms vibrate, subatomic particles vibrate. Nothing is completely still. What appears to be a solid, stable object is actually an unimaginably complex dance of energy occurring beneath the limits of human perception. This is where many spiritual traditions and Hermetic teachings become particularly interested. The Hermetic principle of vibration states that everything moves, everything vibrates, and nothing rests. Modern physics isn't saying exactly the same thing, but it does reveal a universe that is far less solid and static than our everyday experience suggests. Now, advocates of fifth dimensional consciousness take this a step further. They suggest that what we call the third dimension is not merely a physical location, but a state of consciousness associated with denser forms of energy, slower vibration, stronger experiences of separation, and the belief that we are isolated individuals moving through a material universe. In this model, the reason matter appears so fixed and solid is because consciousness is experiencing reality through a very focused, very dense lens. It's like looking at a single frozen frame of a movie rather than seeing the entire film. By contrast, fifth dimensional traditions describe a reality where energy is less dense, consciousness is less restricted, and the boundaries between mind, matter, time, and space become far more flexible. The walls don't disappear. The atoms don't suddenly stop existing. Rather, awareness itself is supposedly operating from a completely different perspective. An analogy I find helpful is ice, water, and steam. Chemically, they're all the same thing, H2O. The difference is the state they're operating in. Third-dimensional reality is often described as the ice version of consciousness, dense, structured, and apparently separate. Fifth-dimensional reality is more like steam, less dense, more interconnected, less confined by the boundaries that seem absolute from the perspective of the ice cube. Whether that's physics, philosophy, metaphysics, or bullshit is ultimately up to you. But that's the basic idea. When people talk about Atlantis as a fifth-dimensional civilization, they're not usually claiming Atlanteans lived on a floating cloud in another universe. They're claiming Atlanteans experienced reality itself differently. They allegedly viewed consciousness as fundamental, matter as energetic, time as flexible, and separation as something closer to an illusion than an ultimate truth. And if that sounds like we've already left conventional archaeology somewhere back at the car park, don't worry. I know we're only 15 minutes into the episode and we're already dismantling reality. This is where both science and spirituality start using some surprisingly similar language, even if they're talking about very different things. Max Planck, one of the fathers of quantum theory, argued that matter may emerge from a deeper underlying reality. Tesla famously said, "If you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration." To be clear, Tesla was not talking about Atlantis. He wasn't building crystal-powered anti-gravity machines between coffee breaks, but his ideas became incredibly popular within metaphysical circles because vibration appears everywhere in nature. Sound vibrates, light vibrates, atoms vibrate. The molecules inside your body are vibrating right now. Nothing is truly still. The Hermetic traditions took this idea even further. One of the principles found in the Kybalion states, "Nothing rests, everything moves, everything vibrates." Hermetics creates the foundation for what many spiritual traditions mean when they talk about a higher vibration. They are not suggesting your body suddenly turns into a tuning fork. The idea is that consciousness itself exists on a spectrum. States such as fear, shame, guilt, and anger are considered lower frequencies, while gratitude, compassion, joy, peace, and love are considered higher ones. This concept became famous through psychiatrist David Hawkins and his map of consciousness, which attempted to organize different states of awareness along a scale of energetic development. In this model, Atlantis before the fall wasn't simply technologically advanced, it was operating at a much higher collective frequency of consciousness. And this is where things get really weird. One of the most common claims about fifth dimensional reality is that time doesn't work the way we think it does. Dolores Cannon repeatedly reported through thousands of regression sessions that subjects describe time as an illusion and linear time as something largely unique to our human physical experience. Outside of that experience, they described events as existing simultaneously rather than sequentially. A useful analogy is a book. We experience our lives page by page, chapter by chapter, without knowing what comes next. Unlike a completed novel, however, the book of our lives is still being written. The pages behind us already exist, but many of the pages ahead remain unwritten and are shaped by choice, experience, and consciousness itself. Some fifth dimensional teachings suggest that consciousness is not limited to moving through time one moment at a time. From that perspective, consciousness may be able to perceive a broader view of the story, seeing possible chapters, themes, and pathways rather than a single predetermined ending. The future is therefore not fixed. It exists as a range of potentials that can shift as individuals and the collective make choices. This is also why soul contracts do not always unfold as planned. They may establish themes, lessons, or opportunities, but how those experiences manifest can vary significantly. This is where the Wilcock 3A3T model becomes relevant, although that's a discussion for a completely separate episode. If your brain just made a strange noise, don't worry, that's normal. Another common concept is unity consciousness. Rather than experiencing ourselves as separate individuals, consciousness is viewed as fundamentally interconnected. Imagine waves on the ocean. From the surface, they look separate. Different shapes, different sizes, different directions, but underneath, they're all the same body of water. Unity consciousness proposes that humanity eventually recognizes itself not as separate waves, but as the ocean itself. This perspective also leads to ideas such as light bodies, accelerated healing, and the absence of disease. According to these traditions, illness begins as energetic imbalance before manifesting physically. In a state of coherence, harmony, and higher consciousness, those imbalances supposedly struggle to take hold. The analogy often used is heat. An ice cube can survive comfortably in a freezer, but it cannot maintain its form in an oven. The theory suggests that lower states such as chronic fear, separation, and conflict create the conditions for disease, while love, coherence, and unity create an energetic environment where those patterns cannot easily survive. Whether that's literally true or a conversation for another day, whether that's literally true is a conversation for another day, but that's the underlying philosophy. And finally, we arrive at the idea that gets the left brain people reaching for a Nurofen. Many of these traditions propose that consciousness doesn't merely observe reality, it participates in creating it. In this worldview, matter and consciousness are deeply interconnected. Reality behaves like a vast holographic system, and every individual is a fractal expression of the larger whole. Now, before we accidentally spend 3 hours discussing quantum mechanics, observer effects, holographic universes, and whether reality is fundamentally informational, let's park that thought, because that rabbit hole deserves an episode all on its own. For now, this is the key takeaway. When people describe Atlantis as a fifth dimensional civilization, they are not simply claiming it had better technology. They are describing a civilization that allegedly understood consciousness, matter, time, and reality itself in a completely different way. A world where telepathy was normal, manifestation was almost immediate, healing was accelerated, separation was largely illusory, and consciousness was regarded as the fundamental fabric of existence. Whether that's history, mythology, metaphysics, symbolism, or humanity collectively spiraling into the cosmic basement is impossible to say. But if that's what Atlantis was believed to be, then the giant crystals are about to become the least weird thing in this story. Technology. Beyond the mechanical model. Consciousness as technology. One of the most fascinating ideas to emerge from the Atlantis story is that consciousness wasn't simply something Atlanteans possessed. According to many esoteric traditions, it was something they actively used. While modern society tends to treat consciousness as a byproduct of the brain, Atlantis traditions often reverse the equation entirely. In these models, consciousness wasn't sitting quietly in the passenger seat while technology drove the vehicle. Consciousness was behind the wheel. This theme appears repeatedly in the work of Edgar Cayce, Dolores Cannon, the Law of One Material, various Hermetic traditions, and modern consciousness researchers. While the specific details differ, the underlying idea remains remarkably consistent. The most advanced Atlantean technology may not have been mechanical at all. Their greatest discovery may have been consciousness itself. That possibility becomes particularly interesting when we remember that modern science still doesn't have a complete explanation for consciousness. We know it exists. We experience it every second of our lives. Yet nobody can fully explain how subjective awareness emerges from physical matter. Atlantis traditions simply start from a different assumption altogether. Instead of asking how matter produces consciousness, they ask whether consciousness produces matter. Consciousness as a fundamental force. Most modern scientific frameworks assume that consciousness emerges from the brain. According to many Atlantis-related traditions, however, consciousness is not something generated by biology. It is a fundamental component of reality itself. This idea appears throughout Eastern philosophy, Hermetic teachings, the Law of One Material, the work of Wilcock, and countless regression accounts recorded by Dolores Cannon. In these models, consciousness is not the product of the universe. Consciousness is one of the ingredients from which the universe emerges. Wilcock, drawing heavily from Edgar Cayce, the Law of One, and various consciousness researchers, proposes that consciousness functions more like a field than a byproduct. In this view, your brain doesn't create awareness any more than a radio creates a radio station. The radio receives, translates, and broadcasts a signal that already exists. Consciousness, according to this model, is the signal. This idea became particularly popular in alternative research circles following a series of Russian experiments often referred to as the DNA phantom effect. According to the claims, researchers observed that after a DNA sample was removed from an experimental chamber, an energetic imprint remained, as though information associated with the DNA continued to occupy the space. In other words, consciousness may not be something your brain produces. Your brain may simply be the interface through which a much larger field of awareness experiences physical reality. And yes, I appreciate that we've now reached the part of the episode where mainstream neuroscience is staring nervously at the exits. But if Atlantis traditions are correct, this wasn't considered an extraordinary idea. It was considered the starting point. Their science allegedly didn't begin with matter and eventually discover consciousness. It began with consciousness and used that understanding to explain matter. A useful analogy is a television. Most people assume the picture lives inside the television, but the television is simply receiving and translating a signal. If consciousness research first is correct, the brain may function in a similar way. Consciousness exists independently, while the brain and body acts more like a biological receiver. The observer and participation in creation. This naturally leads to one of the most provocative concepts in the entire Atlantis story. The possibility that consciousness doesn't merely observe reality, but participates in shaping it. Now, before anyone starts mentally manifesting yachts, private islands, and lottery wins, that's not generally what these traditions mean. The claim is not that every passing thought instantly becomes reality. Rather, consciousness, intention, belief, and attention may influence the experiences that unfold around us in ways that we do not fully understand yet. What I find amusing is that Atlantis traditions rarely present this as spirituality. They present it as technology. Another recurring theme is the existence of information fields that exist independently of individual minds. This concept appears in ideas surrounding the Akashic records, Carl Jung's collective unconscious, Rupert Sheldrake's morphic resonance theories, remote viewing research, and numerous regression accounts. The basic proposition is that information exists within a larger field of awareness and that consciousness can access it under certain conditions. Think of it like a cloud, except nobody can locate the server room. Well, some people can. Most people can't locate the server room, and login credentials require enlightenment. If consciousness really was fundamental, then Atlantean technology would likely look very different from modern technology. Most of our inventions exist because humans have limitations. We build phones because we cannot communicate telepathically, allegedly. We use keyboards because computers cannot read our thoughts. Hopefully. We develop navigation systems because most of us struggle to find a shopping centre without getting lost. If consciousness could directly interact with technology, many of those physical interfaces might become unnecessary. Thought-responsive systems. Numerous Atlantis accounts describe technologies that respond directly to the thoughts, emotions, or intentional focus of the operator. Rather than pressing buttons, users allegedly interacted with systems through consciousness itself. According to some traditions, the machine wasn't responding to a physical command. It was responding to awareness, which means Atlantis may have been the only civilization in history where emotional regulation was considered a technical skill. Many accounts suggest that intention functioned almost like an energy source. The technology didn't simply react to physical actions. It reacted to the conscious state of the individual using it. Edgar Cayce's readings frequently connected consciousness with energy systems, while Dolores Cannon's clients often described technologies that appeared partly biological, partly energetic, and partly consciousness-based. In other words, Atlanteans may have viewed focused intention the way that we view electricity. Many descriptions portray Atlantean technology as a partnership between the operator and the system. The machine provided capability. The consciousness provided direction. Rather than humans controlling machines, the two functioned as a single integrated process. Today we're experimenting with brain-computer interfaces and AI-assisted technologies. Atlantis traditions suggest an extreme version of that concept, where consciousness itself becomes the user interface. If awareness can directly influence technology, physical controls become increasingly redundant. Why build switches if thought can activate a system? Why create keyboards if information can be exchanged directly? Why develop communication devices if telepathy becomes commonplace? According to many Atlantis traditions, the highest forms of technology eventually become almost invisible because consciousness replaces the need for external control mechanisms, which sounds impressive or mildly terrifying, or possibly both. The consciousness technology hypothesis proposes that truly advanced civilizations may evolve by developing consciousness rather than machinery. Modern civilization often measures advancement through external technologies, faster computers, better devices, more sophisticated infrastructure. Atlantis traditions frequently propose the opposite. The greatest technological breakthrough is consciousness itself. One of the most common claims involves telepathic communication. Many regression accounts, Cayce readings, and Law of One discussions describe communication occurring directly through consciousness rather than language. Some accounts even describe specialized environments designed to enhance telepathic ability. Essentially, Atlantis may have developed consciousness Wi-Fi before humanity invented actual Wi-Fi. Remote viewing appears repeatedly throughout Atlantis narratives. The idea that consciousness itself could access distant information without physical travel, instead of sending a satellite, You sent awareness. Instead of launching a probe, you launched consciousness, which potentially renders Google Earth slightly less impressive. This is where things really start spiraling. Some traditions describe technologies capable of healing through frequency, accessing information fields, inducing altered states, enhancing consciousness, facilitating manifestation, and allowing direct interaction between intention and matter. In these stories, Atlanteans allegedly approached reality less like engineers operating machinery and more like participants interacting with a living energetic system. Rather than manipulating energy from the outside, they worked with reality from within. Multiple regression accounts describe specialized rooms or structures designed to amplify telepathic communication. Whether these were actual technologies, symbolic memories, or altered state experiences remains unknown, but the concept appears frequently across Atlantis literature. And it's kind of where I was going with episode 1 with the pyramids and the structures that the scans revealed underneath. That if you Google the images of the SAR scans, you can see these huge like columns going underneath with almost like these resonance chambers. And it's like, well, what were those chambers? What was the purpose? If we still can't even, we're still arguing about, how they placed the stones there, let alone these structures that apparently go 650 meters below the surface of the Great Pyramid. The pyramid's only 146 meters, so how did they get all of this stuff underneath? It's crazy. But we will explore that in the next episode as well, when we talk about where the knowledge went after Atlantis, because that's where I'm going with this. So where was I at? Frequency-based healing appears in Cayce's readings, Cannon's regressions, Atlantis traditions, and countless modern alternative health systems. The underlying belief is that illness represents energetic disharmony and that restoring coherent frequencies promotes healing. Many traditions describe a state where consciousness influences physical reality more directly than it appears to today. What modern spirituality often calls manifestation, Atlantean traditions frequently describe as a practical application of consciousness. In other words, manifestation wasn't a self-help workshop. It was allegedly part of the engineering department. The Akashic records appear throughout Cayce's work and many regression traditions as a universal repository of information accessible through consciousness. Think of it as a cosmic cloud library. Except the password recovery system appears to involve meditation or entering altered states of awareness, which is what we do through QHHT. Many traditions describe temples, chambers, crystals, and resonance technologies designed to facilitate expanded states of awareness. The goal was not entertainment, but to access information, healing, insight, and higher consciousness. Numerous Atlantis accounts include stories of advanced biological science and genetic experimentation. These are among the most controversial aspects of the Atlantis narrative and frequently appear in both Cayce and Cannon-related material. Perhaps the most extraordinary idea of all is that the technology itself required a coherent user. Knowledge wasn't enough. Training wasn't enough. Consciousness mattered. The machine responded not just to what you knew, but to who you were. And that brings us to the question that sits at the center of virtually every Atlantis mystery. What if consciousness was not a side effect of Atlantean science? What if consciousness was the operating system? Because If that was true, the giant crystals, energy grids, and advanced devices weren't the revolutionary part. They were just the apps. Crystals, resonance, and acoustics. If consciousness was the operating system of Atlantis, then crystals, sound, light, and geometry may have been the hardware. And yes, I appreciate that sentence just caused several physicists to instinctively reach for a stress ball. Because if you've spent any time in Atlantis research, you'll quickly discover that every road eventually leads back to crystals. You can begin with Plato, you can begin with Cayce, you can begin with consciousness studies, ancient Egypt, sacred geometry, the law of one. Sooner or later, someone will emerge from a side corridor carrying a giant crystal and insisting it's the key to everything. The obvious question is why? The universe of vibration. One of the core assumptions behind many Atlantean theories is that the universe is fundamentally vibrational in nature. That sounds mystical, but it's worth remembering that both science and spirituality have spent centuries describing reality in terms of motion and energy. Atoms vibrate, molecules vibrate, light travels as electromagnetic waves, sound propagates through vibrations. Even what appears to be solid matter is actually a dynamic system in constant motion. The Hermetic tradition summarized this idea thousands of years ago with the principle, nothing rests, everything moves, everything vibrates. Now, Hermetic philosophy isn't physics, and physics isn't Hermetic philosophy, but it's interesting that both arrive at a similar observation. Reality is far more dynamic than it appears from our everyday perspective. This leads directly to the concept of frequency and resonance. If you've ever pushed a child on a swing, you've used resonance. Push at the right moment, the swing goes higher. Push at the wrong moment, you waste energy. Tiny inputs, when applied at precisely the correct frequency, can create surprisingly large effects. Atlantis traditions frequently propose that the civilization understood resonance at an extraordinary level. Rather than forcing nature to comply through brute mechanical power, they allegedly learned how to work with the natural frequencies already present within matter, energy, and consciousness. Another concept that appears repeatedly is coherence. In simple terms, coherence occurs when multiple systems operate in harmony rather than chaos. Imagine the difference between an orchestra tuning up and an orchestra performing a symphony. The same musicians are present, but the level of coherence is dramatically different. Theories suggest consciousness itself could become coherent, and that highly coherent individuals were capable of interacting with technology, energy systems, and information fields in ways unavailable to ordinary states of awareness. Now we've arrived at the giant crystals. I know some of you have been waiting patiently. The most famous descriptions come from Edgar Cayce's Atlantis readings, where enormous crystals were allegedly used as energy collection, amplification, and transmission devices. Similar concepts later appeared in the Law of One material, Dolores Cannon's regression work, and numerous modern Atlantis narratives. According to these accounts, Atlantean crystals may have functioned as energy storage devices, amplifiers, information repositories, communication systems, healing instruments, grid stabilizers, consciousness responsive interfaces, directed energy sources, and navigational tools. In other words, Atlantis apparently looked at a crystal and thought, what if we turned this into the Swiss Army knife of civilization? Now, before we all start building giant quartz towers in the backyard, it's important to separate what is known from what is claimed. Quartz is genuinely remarkable. It's piezoelectric, meaning it generates electrical charges when mechanical pressure is applied. Modern electronics rely heavily on quartz crystals for timing and frequency stabilization. Quartz appears in watches, computers, radios, communication systems, and countless electronic devices. Crystalline structures are also used in lasers, optics, sensors, and some forms of information storage technology. So the idea that crystals can interact with energy and information is not controversial. What's controversial is the giant Atlantis part. There is currently no archaeological evidence demonstrating the existence of massive Atlantean power crystals capable of running entire civilizations, opening portals, or changing planetary energy grids. In other words, modern science absolutely supports the statements. Crystals can do interesting things. It does not currently support this 7-story quartz obelisk powers telepathy across 3 continents. Sound as an engineering tool. If crystals are one half of the Atlantis technology story, then sound is the other. This is where we encounter one of my favourite rabbit holes, cymatics. Cymatics is the study of visible patterns created by sound vibrations. When frequencies pass through water, sand, or other materials, remarkably complex geometric patterns emerge. Change the frequency and the pattern changes. Cymatics proves that sound is capable of influencing physical systems in ways most people find surprising. Modern science also demonstrates acoustic manipulation on small scales. Researchers have used sound waves to levitate droplets, move particles, and influence materials under controlled conditions. Cue every Atlantis researcher immediately asking, "Excellent, if we can do that with tiny particles today, what could an advanced civilization have achieved?" This is where theories involving acoustic engineering, megalithic construction, and levitation traditions begin to emerge. Various ancient cultures preserve stories of stones being moved through sound, chanting, or harmonic techniques. The underlying idea is simple. If frequency can influence matter, then perhaps sufficiently advanced knowledge could manipulate matter far more dramatically than we currently understand. Whether that's an undiscovered science, misunderstood mythology, or pure speculation remains open to debate. The final piece of the puzzle brings us to sacred geometry. One of the strangest patterns in ancient cultures is the recurring appearance of geometric forms, circles, spirals, golden ratios, hexagons, platonic solids, complex proportional relationships. For some researchers, these patterns are artistic. For others, they are mathematical. For Atlantis enthusiasts, they are practically a user manual. The theory proposes that geometry represents the way energy naturally organizes itself. Just as sound creates patterns in cymatics, energy fields may produce predictable geometric structures. This leads into the concept of standing waves. Imagine plucking a guitar string. Certain frequencies create stable wave patterns that appear fixed even though energy is flowing through them. Some researchers have suggested that matter itself might be understood as a form of stabilized energetic pattern. Again, we're entering deeply speculative territory here, but it forms an important part of Atlantis lore. In this framework, sound, light, geometry, and consciousness are not separate phenomena. They're different expressions of the same underlying principles. Sound organizes matter. Geometry reflects energetic order. Light carries information. Consciousness interacts with all of them. And Atlantis, according to these traditions, allegedly understood how the entire system fit together. Whether that's historical reality, symbolic wisdom, or humanity's most ambitious game of cosmic connect the dots remains impossible to say. But one thing is certain. If Atlantis really did combine consciousness, crystals, acoustics, and geometry into a unified science, then we are no longer discussing a civilization that merely built better tools. We're discussing a civilization that believed reality itself was programmable. Energy grids and planetary engineering. At this point, I'd like to remind everyone that we started this trilogy asking whether Atlantis was real. We are now discussing whether an ancient civilization may have operated a planetary consciousness network connected through giant crystals, sacred geometry, earth energy grids, and possibly weather control technology. If you've stayed with me this far, firstly, thank you. Secondly, we have officially left conventional archaeology somewhere back around episode 1. Because once you combine consciousness technology, crystal systems, resonance, geometry, and advanced energy concepts, the next logical question becomes, what were they powering? And according to many theories, the answer wasn't just cities, it was the planet itself. Beyond conventional power. One of the recurring themes found in Cayce's readings, The Law of One, modern Atlantis literature, and researchers like Wilcock is the idea that Atlanteans didn't generate energy the way we do. Modern civilization is essentially built on setting things on fire. Coal, gas, oil, wood. Humanity's greatest technological achievement might simply be finding increasingly sophisticated ways to burn shit. According to many Atlantis theories, however, advanced civilizations eventually moved beyond combustion entirely. Instead of extracting energy from fuel, they worked directly with fields. This is where concepts such as field-based energy systems, ambient energy collection, and even zero-point energy begin appearing. Now let's be very clear. Zero-point energy is a legitimate concept within quantum physics. The claim that it can be harvested as an unlimited energy source remains unproven. But Atlantis researchers looked at the phrase vacuum energy and collectively said, excellent, we shall be unsupervised with this information. The core idea is that energy is abundant throughout the universe and that sufficiently advanced civilizations learned how to access it without burning, without drilling, without mining or consuming vast physical resources. In these theories, Atlantis had effectively moved beyond the energetic equivalent of campfires and internal combustion engines. Whether that happened or not is another question. Earth's energy grid. This brings us to one of the most enduring ideas in alternative history. The Earth itself may possess an energetic grid. Now, before anyone writes an angry email, there is no accepted scientific evidence proving the existence of global ley line networks carrying mysterious energy around the planet. However, the idea has been around for more than a century and appears repeatedly throughout Atlantis literature. Ley lines were originally proposed by amateur archaeologist Alfred Watkins in the 1920s, who noticed alignments between ancient landmarks, standing stones, sacred sites, and monuments. Over time, the idea evolved far beyond Watkins' original observations. Many researchers began proposing that sacred sites weren't randomly distributed. Instead, they were allegedly positioned at energetic nodes within a larger planetary grid. This is where things get particularly interesting, because if you gather enough Atlantis researchers in one room long enough, eventually somebody points at a map and starts drawing lines between the Great Pyramid, Stonehenge, Machu Picchu, Easter Island, Angkor Wat, the Nazca lines, and whatever mountain they currently believe contains an interdimensional portal. The theories vary enormously, but the central idea remains consistent. Ancient cultures may have understood something about the Earth that modern humanity has forgotten. According to these models, sacred sites were not merely ceremonial locations. They were functional components in a much larger energetic network. Pyramids become grid nodes. Temples become amplifiers, sacred mountains become stabilizers. And suddenly Atlantis starts sounding less like a civilization and more like a planetary utility company. Planetary infrastructure. If an energy grid existed, what was it actually doing? Some theories suggest the network distributed energy globally, much like an electrical grid. Others propose environmental regulation systems capable of influencing weather, balancing ecosystems, or harmonizing planetary conditions. Again, we need to separate established fact from speculative theory. There is currently no archaeological evidence proving Atlanteans controlled weather, stabilized earthquakes, prevented volcanic eruptions, or operated a global earth management system. However, those ideas appear repeatedly in modern Atlantis narratives. Theories include ley-line energy networks linking sacred sites, pyramids functioning as resonant nodes within a planetary system, atmospheric energy collection, wireless power transmission, water purification systems, weather moderation technologies, tectonic stabilization mechanisms, planetary consciousness amplification, geometrically aligned portals connecting distant locations. In short, Atlantis researchers looked at an entire planet and said, what if this was all part of the infrastructure? One of the more fascinating aspects of these stories is that Atlantis is often described not as a civilization controlling nature, but as a civilization cooperating with nature. The emphasis is frequently on stewardship rather than exploitation. Maintaining balance, working with ecosystems, harmonizing planetary systems, which is a notably different philosophy from humanity's current approach of repeatedly poking nature with a stick and then acting surprised when nature pokes back. Honestly, what the fuck are we doing? Underlying many of these theories is an even bigger idea. What if Earth itself is alive? This concept appears in many ancient traditions and became popular in modern discussions through the Gaia hypothesis proposed by scientist James Lovelock. Gaia doesn't suggest the Earth is alive in the same way a human being is alive. Rather, it proposes that Earth functions as a vast, self-regulating system in which the living organisms and the environment continuously influence one another. Atlantis traditions often take that concept several steps further. In many versions of the story, the Earth is not only a living system, but a conscious system. The planet possesses energetic fields. The planet possesses awareness. Human consciousness interacts with planetary consciousness. Sacred sites become points of exchange between the two. Now, does science currently support the existence of a conscious planetary mind? In these models, Atlantis wasn't simply drawing energy from the Earth. It was participating in a relationship with the Earth. The civilization functioned almost like an organ within a larger living system. And that creates a very different picture of what advanced technology might look like. Instead of dominating nature, it works with nature. Instead of extracting from the system, it supports the system. Instead of treating the planet as a resource, it treats the planet as a partner. Whether that's historical reality, mythology, spiritual philosophy, or one of humanity's most ambitious thought experiments, remains impossible to prove. Sorry, I think that's what I was saying before. I said, does science currently support the existence of a conscious planetary mind? The answer would be no. We know that, right? Okay, genetic and biological technology. If consciousness technology, crystal power systems, and planetary energy grids weren't enough to make mainstream archaeology reach for a stiff drink, we now arrive at what is arguably the most controversial part of the Atlantis story: biological engineering. Because according to numerous esoteric traditions, Atlantis wasn't merely experimenting with energy and consciousness, it may have also been experimenting with life itself. Now, before we proceed any further, an important disclaimer. There is absolutely no archaeological evidence for ancient Atlantean gene editing laboratories, consciousness transfer facilities, or hybrid breeding programs. What follows comes from esoteric traditions, regression accounts, mythological parallels, and metaphysical sources such as Cayce, Cannon, the Law of One, and related traditions. However, the reason we wouldn't be able to find anything archaeologically is because it's like Graham Hancock said, it would all be underneath the ocean. And we haven't explored the majority of what's underneath the ocean, believe me. Anyway, that said, the recurring themes are fascinating, particularly because humanity has been telling remarkably similar stories for thousands of years. Biology is information. One of the most profound discoveries of modern science is that life runs on information. At the center of every living cell sits DNA, a biological coding system containing the instructions needed to build and maintain life. In many ways, DNA is nature's software. Your body isn't simply made of matter. It's made of information organized into matter, which is one reason some Atlantis researchers become very excited very quickly. Because if consciousness researchers propose that reality itself may be informational in nature, and biologists tell us living systems operate through information, then suddenly biology, consciousness, and Atlantis all awkwardly end up sharing the same elevator. Modern science has also shown that genes are only part of the story. The field of epigenetics demonstrates that gene expression can be influenced by environmental conditions, behavior, stress, nutrition, and other factors. In other words, your DNA is not necessarily a rigid blueprint. It's more like a dynamic instruction manual responding to its environment. Atlantis traditions often take this idea much further, proposing that consciousness itself may influence biological systems in ways we do not yet understand. Whether that's true remains an open question, but it forms a major part of the Atlantis narrative. Directed evolution. This is where things get weird. According to numerous regression accounts recorded by Cannon alongside themes found in other esoteric sources, Atlantis was allegedly experimenting with biological life on a large scale. These stories include descriptions of hybrid organisms, modified human bodies, artificially created life forms, manipulation of consciousness within physical vessels, attempts to influence reproduction and evolution, and even the creation of specialized servant classes. Now let's pause before anyone starts emailing the History Channel. These accounts should not be treated as evidence that ancient genetic laboratories existed. They belong in the category of esoteric testimony, symbolic narratives, and mythological possibilities. What's interesting, however, is how often similar ideas appear throughout ancient mythology. The Greeks gave us centaurs, satyrs, minotaurs, and countless hybrid creatures. Egyptian traditions gave us gods with both human and animal characteristics. Mesopotamian traditions contain stories of engineered beings, divine creation, and altered forms of life. Throughout the world, we repeatedly encounter narratives involving the modification, creation, or hybridization of living beings. The question becomes, are these merely symbolic myths? Are they spiritual metaphors? Or are they distant cultural memories encoded through symbolic language because the original concepts became impossible to understand literally? I'm not claiming any of those interpretations are correct, but it's an interesting question, especially when we consider that modern humanity is now actively experimenting with CRISPR gene editing, synthetic biology, genetic enhancement, and technologies that would have sounded indistinguishable from magic only a few generations ago. For the first time in history, we're beginning to acquire capabilities that make some of these ancient stories feel slightly less impossible than they once did, which is either exciting or mildly terrifying depending on how much coffee you've consumed. Consciousness and biology. One of the more interesting aspects of Atlantis traditions is that biology and consciousness are rarely treated as separate subjects. In modern medicine, we generally divide the body and mind into different categories. Many spiritual traditions suggest that thoughts, emotions, beliefs, and energetic states may directly influence human biology and physical health. Now, to a certain extent, modern science already acknowledges a version of this. Stress affects the immune system, emotional states influence hormones, psychological well-being impacts physical health. The Atlantis model simply extends the concept much further. According to these traditions, consciousness isn't merely influencing biology. Consciousness is helping organize biology. This is why so many Atlantis narratives include stories of enhanced healing, regeneration, and extraordinary longevity. The idea is that if consciousness and biology are deeply connected, then learning to work with consciousness could dramatically affect the body's ability to repair itself. Humanity is a living experiment. Perhaps the most intriguing question in the Atlantis narrative is not what the Atlanteans did. It's why so many traditions seem obsessed with humanity itself. Across ancient religions, mystery schools, esoteric traditions, channeled material, and regression accounts, humanity is repeatedly portrayed as possessing unrealized potential. We're told we once knew more. We're told we've forgotten something. We're told we are evolving towards something. We're told consciousness itself is developing through the human experience. Atlantis stories often fit into this broader narrative. Some describe humanity as the result of evolutionary acceleration. Others describe hybridization events. Others suggest Earth functions as a kind of consciousness development school where different lessons, experiences, and forms of growth take place. Whether we're examining Greek myths, Egyptian symbolism, Mesopotamian creation stories, Cayce's readings, Cannon's regressions, or the law of one material, the same basic question keeps appearing. What is humanity actually capable of becoming? Because at its core, the Atlantis story may not really be about a lost civilization. It may be about human potential. The advanced technology, the giant crystals, the consciousness science, the energy grids, and the legendary wisdom all point towards the same possibility. That Atlantis wasn't remembered because it possessed extraordinary machines. Atlantis was remembered because it represented an extraordinary version of humanity. Whether that version ever existed is another question entirely. But if Atlantis serves as a mirror, the real mystery might not be what happened to them. The real mystery might be what happens to us. The fall from 5D theory. Now we arrive at one of the most fascinating, controversial, and frankly reality-bending ideas in the Atlantis story. The theory that Atlantis didn't simply fall beneath the ocean. Human consciousness fell with it. To be absolutely clear, this is not geology, archaeology, or established science. This idea comes primarily from esoteric traditions, the law of one material, Atlantis literature, regression accounts, and various metaphysical teachings. But because it appears so consistently across different sources, it's worth exploring. According to these traditions, ancient humanity once existed in a much less dense state of consciousness. Atlantis wasn't simply more technologically advanced. It allegedly operated from a higher level of awareness where telepathy was normal, separation was less pronounced, consciousness interacted more directly with reality, and humanity experienced itself as fundamentally connected. In this model, the word density doesn't necessarily refer to physical weight. It refers to the level of consciousness through which reality is experienced. Think of it like the difference between a symphony orchestra and a room full of toddlers attacking musical instruments. Both contain sound. One contains coherence, the other contains terror. According to these traditions, Atlantean civilization Atlantean civilization initially operated in a highly coherent state where consciousness, technology, and nature existed in relative harmony. However, as the society became increasingly focused on power, control, and technological manipulation, the balance allegedly began to break down. This is where many Atlantis narratives introduced the idea that consciousness technology itself became part of the problem. The same systems that were supposedly capable of healing, energy generation, and planetary harmonization allegedly began to be used for control, experimentation, and pursuit over power. Cayce, the Law of One, and numerous regression accounts all contain versions of this story. Technology advances faster than wisdom. Sound familiar? Because it's essentially the oldest story humanity knows. Give people extraordinary power, and eventually someone says, I wonder what happens if I press this. According to the esoteric account, the misuse of consciousness technology didn't merely destabilize society. It destabilized the energetic field of the planet itself. Now, whether we're talking about giant crystals, planetary grids, consciousness fields, or some symbolic representation of collective human behavior, depends entirely on which version of the story you're reading. But the core theme remains remarkably consistent. The catastrophe that followed was not simply physical, it was conscious. Atlantis was allegedly destroyed through a combination of environmental collapse, geological upheaval, energetic imbalance, and collective disharmony. The result wasn't just floods, earthquakes, and destruction. Humanity itself allegedly shifted into a denser state of awareness. In this interpretation, the fall doesn't simply describe continents sinking beneath the ocean. It describes consciousness becoming more deeply identified with physical reality, more focused on survival, more focused on separation, more focused on material existence, more trapped within linear time. Human beings began to experience themselves as isolated individuals instead of interconnected aspects of a larger whole. Unity became separation. Coherence became fragmentation. Knowing became believing. And consciousness became increasingly identified with matter. One way to think about it is this. Imagine a person suffering amnesia. Their abilities may still exist, but their memory of those abilities has disappeared. According to many traditions, humanity after the fall resembles a species with spiritual amnesia, not broken, not diminished, simply forgetting what it once knew. This is why so many esoteric traditions describe human history as a process of remembering rather than learning. The knowledge was never completely lost, it became buried. And perhaps that's why variations of the fall appear all over the world. The Garden of Eden, the loss of the Golden Age, the fall of Atlantis, the decline from harmony into chaos, the departure from paradise, different cultures, different symbols, remarkably similar themes. Whether these stories describe actual historical events, psychological archetypes, or metaphysical truths is impossible to know. But it does raise some fascinating questions. Curious questions. Could the world stories about golden ages and great falls preserve distant memories of a genuine civilizational trauma? Could what ancient people have described as a fall from grace actually represent a collapse in collective consciousness rather than merely a political or geological disaster? When esoteric traditions speak of humanity becoming more dense, are they describing metaphysical realities, or are they using symbolic language for something we see all the time? A loss of coherence, empathy, wisdom, and connection. And perhaps the biggest question of all, if Atlantis fell because consciousness became disconnected from wisdom, then are these stories really about the distant past, or are they actually warnings about the future? The factions. Who tried to stop the fall? Every great civilization story eventually becomes a story about choices. And this is perhaps one of the most fascinating patterns in the Atlantis stories. Atlantis doesn't simply wake up one morning and sink. Something changes first. A division appears, a conflict emerges, and a choice must be made. Because according to the Cayce-derived Atlantis accounts, Atlantean society eventually split into two very different philosophical camps. And this is where Atlantis stops sounding like a story about the ancient past and starts sounding uncomfortably like every civilization in human history. The children or sons of the Law of One. According to Cayce's readings and the traditions that later developed around them, one faction became known as the Children of the Law of One, sometimes called the Sons of the Law of One. Now, if you've listened to everything we've discussed so far, you'll probably assume these were the people hanging around giant crystals discussing consciousness, telepathy, and frequency healing. And you'd be correct. But according to the tradition, they represented something much deeper than that. The Law of One taught that all life ultimately emerges from the same source. What appears separate is, at a deeper level, connected. Humanity, nature, consciousness, and creation itself were viewed as expressions of a single underlying reality. In simple terms, the children of the Law of One believed that power should serve life, not the other way around. According to the Atlantis narratives, they advocated for unity with the Creator, responsible use of technology, individual freedom, service to others, preservation of sacred knowledge, and the ethical application of consciousness science. They allegedly understood that technologies capable of transforming civilization also carried enormous responsibility. Perhaps most importantly, they appear repeatedly in Atlantis traditions as the people ringing the alarm bell. They were the ones warning that technology without wisdom was dangerous, that consciousness technology without ethics was dangerous, that power without accountability was dangerous, which, to be fair, has been excellent advice throughout all of human history. These traditions also describe the children of the Law of One preparing for catastrophe. In some accounts, they established places of refuge. In others, they preserve sacred knowledge. Some stories describe them helping populations evacuate vulnerable regions before later waves of destruction. This is where we find the origins of ideas such as hidden repositories of knowledge, mystery schools, sacred teachings preserved through initiatic traditions, and even the famous Hall of Records associated with Cayce's work. Whether any of these things literally happened is impossible to verify, but the symbolism itself is very powerful. When societies collapse, knowledge survives because somebody made the decision to preserve it. The Sons of Belial. Every story needs a villain. Atlantis naturally decided to make things complicated, because according to these traditions, the opposing faction wasn't necessarily evil in a comic book sense. They were simply obsessed with power. This group became known as the Sons of Belial. In Cayce's accounts and later Atlantis literature, the Sons of Belial are associated with material domination, exploitation, service to self, social inequity, biological manipulation, control systems, and the pursuit of technological capability without corresponding spiritual or ethical development. In modern language, they weren't asking, should we? They were asking, can we? And history repeatedly demonstrates that those are not the same question. Many Atlantis stories describe the Sons of Belial becoming increasingly fascinated with using technology to control society, manipulate biology, increase productivity, expand influence, and consolidate power. Some of the more controversial accounts describe attempts at genetic experimentation, modification of human populations, manipulation of reproduction. Any of this sounding familiar with what we're dealing with today? And the creation of labouring classes designed to serve elite interests. Again and again, the story returns to the same warning. Knowledge without wisdom becomes dangerous. Technology without ethics becomes dangerous. Power without accountability becomes dangerous. Apparently, Atlantis figured out what every science fiction movie has been trying to tell us for the last 50 years. The real villain wasn't technology. The lesson isn't that technology is evil. In fact, the children of the Law of One were allegedly using the same technologies. The crystals weren't evil, the energy grids weren't evil, the consciousness technologies weren't evil. The problem wasn't the tools. The problem was the consciousness of the people using the tools. That's a much more sophisticated lesson. A hammer can build a house or it can be used as a weapon. The hammer isn't making the decision, the operator is. According to these traditions, Atlantean technology became so powerful that it amplified the intentions of those who controlled it. The more powerful the technology became, the more important consciousness became. And eventually, according to the story, wisdom failed to keep pace with power. The ethical spine of the Atlantis story. This is ultimately why the conflict between the children of the Law of One and the sons of Belial matters. Beneath all the giant crystals, fifth dimensional consciousness, planetary grids, and consciousness technology lies a surprisingly simple story. Two groups looked at the same power and saw different futures. One saw an opportunity to serve. The other saw an opportunity to control. One believed technology should elevate humanity. The other believed humanity should serve technology. Honestly, that's what we're looking at right fucking now. Google transhumanism. Google the transhumanist agenda and see what that's about. One sought unity, the other sought domination. And according to the Atlantis traditions, that conflict determined the fate of an entire civilization. Whether Atlantis existed exactly as described is still open to debate, but perhaps that's not the most important question. Because if Atlantis fell for the reasons these traditions describe, then the warning isn't really about Atlantis at all. It's about what happens when a civilization becomes technologically brilliant, but forgets to become wise. After everything we've explored through this episode, we arrive finally at the biggest question of all. What actually happened to Atlantis? The frustrating answer is that it depends entirely on which Atlantis you're talking about. The historical Atlantis, the geological Atlantis, the symbolic Atlantis, the spiritual Atlantis, the consciousness-based Atlantis. Ask 10 researchers what caused the fall and you'll receive 12 different answers. But interestingly, most of them tend to point in roughly the same direction. Plato's account. Let's start with the one source pretty much everyone agrees on. According to Plato, Atlantis was destroyed by earthquakes and floods, vanishing beneath the sea in what he famously described as a single dreadful day and night. No giant crystals, no planetary energy grids, no consciousness collapse, no malfunctioning resonance weapons, just catastrophic natural disaster. Atlantis goes underwater, end of story. Simple. Of course, Atlantis researchers looked at that explanation and collectively said, respectfully, we have some follow-up questions. Geological possibilities. And to be fair, some of those questions are reasonable. Our planet has experienced extraordinary catastrophes throughout its history. Massive volcanic eruptions have altered climates, earthquakes have erased entire cities, tsunamis have devastated coastlines, Sea levels have risen more than 120 metres since the end of the last ice age. Entire landscapes that once existed are now beneath the ocean. If an advanced coastal civilization had existed in vulnerable regions, nature would have had no difficulty in deleting most of the evidence. Some researchers point toward tectonic activity, others suggest volcanic events, some favour tsunami scenarios, others look toward rapid climate shifts and post-ice age flooding. Graham Hancock and others have explored whether a comet or asteroid impact may have contributed to dramatic environmental upheavals during the Younger Dryas period. And perhaps the simplest explanation is this: what if multiple disasters occurring across generations eventually become compressed into a single remembered story? Human beings are excellent storytellers. We're considerably less impressive at preserving perfect historical records over 10,000 years. The esoteric account. Then there's a version that begins with, what if Atlantis accidentally broke reality? According to Cayce-derived traditions, the law of one material, various regression accounts, and later esoteric teachings, Atlantis wasn't destroyed solely by natural forces. It may have contributed to its own downfall. In some versions, advanced crystal technologies became unstable. In others, planetary energy grids were misused. Some accounts describe directed energy experiments. Others describe attempts to manipulate Earth's natural forces. Some traditions even propose that resonance itself became weaponized, which is precisely why no civilization should ever hand a superweapon to someone who says, let's just see what happens. Several traditions suggest Atlantis disrupted the energetic balance of the planet. The catastrophe was not merely geological, it was energetic. Again, none of this belongs within established archaeology. But within the Atlantis tradition, the message is clear. Technology advanced faster than wisdom, power advanced faster than responsibility, and capability advanced faster than consciousness. And eventually something gave way. Some versions also connect the fall to biological manipulation, genetic experimentation, and violations of what these traditions describe as natural law. Others place the blame on a shift toward extreme self-interest, what the law of one refers to as service to self orientation. The details vary, but the lesson stays remarkably consistent. Personally, the more I've explored Atlantis, the less interested I've become in whether the giant crystal exploded. The more interesting question is why every version of the story keeps arriving at the same warning. For me, Atlantis didn't fall because its people were evil. That's too simplistic. Civilizations rarely collapse because everybody suddenly becomes a cartoon villain. They collapse because unhealthy patterns become normal. Atlantis fell when intelligence became separated from wisdom, when technology became separated from ethics, when power became separated from love. According to the traditions, power without restraint became normal. People increasingly surrendered personal sovereignty in exchange for comfort, convenience, and technological advancement. Sacred knowledge gradually transformed into systems of control. The tools themselves weren't the problem. The consciousness operating the tools became the problem. Fear became way amplified. Greed became amplified. Control became amplified. And eventually the civilization created conditions that neither its social systems nor its planetary systems could continue absorbing. Whether that's a literal history lesson or a symbolic one, almost doesn't matter. The pattern is instantly recognizable because we've all seen it before, over and over again. Bringing it all together. We started this episode asking what Atlantis might have been capable of. Somewhere along the way, we discussed a fifth dimensional consciousness, telepathic technology, giant crystals, planetary energy grids, consciousness, responsive systems, biological engineering, reality creation, the collapse of civilization, and whether humanity collectively forgot how reality works. So let's attempt the impossible and pull all of this together. The shift from mechanical to consciousness-based technology. One of the most interesting patterns is that Atlantis stories don't describe a civilization becoming more mechanical. They describe a civilization becoming less mechanical. Modern humanity's solution to almost every problem is to build a machine. Want to communicate? Build a phone. Want information? Build a computer. Want transportation? Build a vehicle. Want entertainment? Build a device capable of distracting you from the fact that you bought the previous device 6 months ago. Atlantis traditions suggest a completely different trajectory. Instead of moving further away from consciousness through increasingly sophisticated hardware, advanced civilizations supposedly move closer to consciousness. The machine becomes less important. The operator becomes more important. The hardware becomes less important. Awareness becomes more important. Energy becomes less important. Resonance becomes more important. Again and again, the stories suggest that the ultimate technology was not a machine sitting outside the user. Technology was the user. And honestly, if that's true, it explains why Atlantis researchers spend so much time talking about consciousness and so little time discussing Atlantean instruction manuals. So what's fascinating is that almost every rabbit hole we've explored eventually circles back to the same 4 concepts. Consciousness, whether we're discussing Cayce, Cannon, the law of one, remote viewing, telepathy, healing, manifestation, or akashic records, consciousness keeps appearing at the center of the picture. Frequency, everything from crystals and acoustics to resonance, sacred geometry and healing technology eventually arrives at vibration, frequency, and coherence. Information, whether it's DNA, consciousness fields, biological systems, the akashic records, or the idea that reality itself may be informational in nature, Atlantis traditions repeatedly describe information as something fundamental. And finally, biology, not as a collection of chemicals, but as a living information system capable of responding to consciousness, environment, and perhaps even collective awareness. What's remarkable is that these themes emerge from sources that are wildly different from one another. Ancient myths, channeled material, regression accounts, mystery traditions, alternative historians, consciousness researchers, different methodologies, different eras, different worldviews, yet they kept returning to the same basic idea, that reality may be far more interconnected than it appears. Implications for humanity. This is the part that keeps some people awake at night, because whether Atlantis existed or not, we're currently having many of the same conversations. AI is advancing exponentially. Genetic engineering is becoming increasingly powerful. Brain-computer interfaces are moving from science fiction into reality. Mass surveillance capabilities continue expanding. Algorithms are already shaping behavior, decision-making, and our attention. Weapons systems are becoming increasingly autonomous. Environmental modification technologies continue developing. Information networks connect billions of minds across the planet. We're creating tools with the power to influence behavior, perception, biology, and society on an unprecedented scale. We possess extraordinary technology power. The question is exactly the same one Atlantis traditions have been asking for decades. Can consciousness evolve as quickly as capability? Because technological acceleration without ethical acceleration creates a very dangerous imbalance. And that's the reason these stories continue to resonate. Not because people are obsessed with a lost island, because they're wondering whether we're looking at a memory, or is it the most precise warning humanity has ever inherited? I believe ancient cultures understood something we've forgotten, but about the relationship between power and consciousness. Consciousness may be the missing piece. The missing piece in our understanding of healing, the missing piece in our understanding of human potential, in our understanding of ancient traditions, and perhaps one day the missing piece in our understanding of reality itself. Looking ahead to part 3 after the fall. So where do we go from here? Well, if Atlantis really did possess advanced technologies that exceeded our own, then the obvious question becomes, what happened to all of it? Because civilizations don't just disappear without leaving stories behind. In the final part of this trilogy, we'll follow the survivors. We'll explore the enduring mystery of the Atlantean crystals. Were they destroyed in the cataclysm, buried beneath the Atlantic Ocean, hidden beneath temples, mountains, or underground repositories? Did fragments of that knowledge travel to Egypt, Tibet, Central America, or other ancient centers of civilization? We'll examine Cayce's legendary Tuaoi, Tuaoi stone or firestone, along with the more speculative claims that remnants of Atlantean technology may still influence an anomalous location such as the Bermuda Triangle. As always, we'll carefully separate historical evidence from esoteric tradition and speculation. We'll also investigate one of the most intriguing figures in the Atlantis narrative, Thoth. Thoth. We'll distinguish the historical Egyptian deity from the later esoteric tradition that portrays Thoth, the Atlantean survivor, priest king, and custodian of sacred science. We'll explore claims that knowledge from Atlantis may have followed into Egypt, North Africa, Mesoamerica, the Andes, Tibet, and beyond, and ask a fascinating question. If a civilization collapsed, would survivors rebuild machines first or preserve mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, and spiritual knowledge? We'll also examine the mysterious traditions surrounding the Melchizedeks, the legendary keepers of sacred wisdom, who in later esoteric teachings become guardians of the universal law, sacred geometry, and consciousness evolution. Alongside them, we'll encounter the equally mysterious Watchers, comparing the ancient Book of Enoch's warning about forbidden knowledge with one of the central lessons of Atlantis itself. Knowledge given before humanity is ready for it can become destructive rather than liberating. From there, we'll tackle one of the most important distinctions in all of esoteric history, the difference between the genuine historical emerald tablet of Hermetic tradition and the modern emerald tablets of Thoth the Atlantean. They are not the same text, and understanding that distinction dramatically changes how we assess many Atlantis claims. And because no Atlantis investigation would be complete without eventually wandering into the deep end of the pool, we'll also examine Nazi occult interests, Antarctica, hidden technology legends, mystery schools, and ancient knowledge repositories, and the enduring claim that something may still be hidden beneath the ice. Don't worry, we'll keep one foot in documented history and the other dangling recklessly over the abyss. Finally, we'll ask perhaps the most important question of the entire trilogy. Did any Atlantean technology actually survive? Maybe nothing survived. Maybe only principles survived, preserved through sacred geometry, mythology, initiation traditions, astronomy, alchemy, and consciousness practices. Or perhaps physical technologies still exist, buried beneath oceans, hidden beneath monuments, sealed within repositories, or inaccessible because they require consciousness rather than mechanical activation. So in part 3, we'll separate history from myth, archaeology from esotericism, and evidence from speculation as we follow the surviving threads of one of humanity's greatest mysteries. We'll explore Thoth, we'll explore Egypt, we'll explore the mystery schools, We'll explore Antarctica and the Nazi-linked interest in mythology, runes, Tibet, pseudo-archaeology, and the I don't know what that word is. Herbs attempts to manufacture an ideological prehistory. German Antarctic expeditions, occult mythology, later attached to advanced weapons and hidden bases. We'll explore what may have survived and ultimately we'll ask, was Atlantis a place, a civilization, a state of consciousness, or all three? I'll see you in part 3. Thank you so much for spending time with me again. Thank you for your curiosity. Thank you for keeping an open mind. If this episode resonated with you, please do like and subscribe. Please anchor the message, anchor the frequency, and share it with someone who asks big questions. So, until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, stay kind, and never stop asking questions, because one question just might change your life. Spiral the fuck out and keep going, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you so much.